Hey guys, alright? Welcome everyone. The story starts in the 30s in Oklahoma, where Margaret Bellum is playing with her 3 daughters in the middle of a field. The children's giggles gradually give way to a horrible cough, and a cloud of dust suddenly dominates the landscape. When the whirlwind knocks her down, Margaret finally wakes up from the terrible nightmare and immediately goes to check if her daughters are alright. At the breakfast table, she offers a prayer before eating, asking God to ease the dust storms and protect her husband, Henry, who is traveling for work. Margaret also asks for protection for her daughters, Rose and Ollie, pleading that they do not become sick like the other children. After the meal, Rose helps her mother take care of the animals, and they do everything they can to conserve their meager resources. When Margaret visits a lonely grave next to a dry tree, we discover that the third daughter did not only exist in a dream. The girl's name was Ada, and she passed away 5 years ago. We also find out that Ollie is hearing impaired. Using sign language, Rose asks if she remembers Sister Ada, and Ollie nods that she does. At night, Margaret tries to seal the window in the daughter's room so that dust doesn't come in. Rose asks about their father, excited about the adventures he might be having, and says she would like to see Philadelphia. With less enthusiasm, their mother suggests that maybe they can travel in the summer, but only if the farm survives. As soon as the mother leaves, Rose and Ollie start reading a story about the legend of the Gray Man, who supposedly set fire to his own house with his whole family inside. The plan was to rid himself of his wife and 5 children, but he was consumed by the flames as well, by accident. According to the legend, his ashes still blow in the air during dust storms, which is when he can be free to walk the earth. Those who do not protect themselves risk inhaling part of him, becoming his puppet. Ollie asks if that's what happened to their mother when she stopped sleeping, and Rose says no, that was just sadness. Before sleeping, Margaret thinks about her husband and the proposal he made before leaving. Henry wanted the whole family to accompany him, but she refused to leave the house behind and abandon Ada's grave. The next day, they go to visit their cousins, Jacob and Thomas, at Aunt Esther's house. They are going through the same struggles, and Margaret realizes that her sister also cannot keep the furniture free of dust. Thomas is coughing a lot, and the doctor said it was pneumonia caused by the excessive dust. Seeing Margaret's reaction, Esther rushes to explain that it is not contagious. Another day passes, and Margaret takes her pills before sleeping, unable to fend off nightmares. One of her few distractions is the quilting meeting at the local church, but, unfortunately, the ladies love to talk about tragedies. According to them, some houses in the area are being invaded and looted. The latest incident ended dramatically, and the family did not survive. The most curious thing is that no one saw the burglar leaving the house after the crime. Worried by the report, Margaret gets startled when the window starts banging and hurts her finger on the needle, staining her embroidery. Days later, Esther decides to leave, saying Jacob is already preparing the wagon. She tells that she had a horrible dream where she suffocated Thomas to make him stop coughing. Margaret thinks it is madness to travel in such weather and insists that just closing the house tightly will keep the family safe, but deep down she is also beginning to doubt that. That very afternoon, the walk back turns into a race against the gigantic dust cloud on the horizon. Arriving home, Ollie gets separated from the other 2 and sees the image of a man standing in the fog. Margaret calls out his name in despair, realizing that her nightmares are becoming reality. She finds Ollie hiding in the closet, trembling with fear and calling for her father. To comfort the girl, their mother suggests they can mark on the closet door how many days are left until Henry returns. When the girls mention the legend of the Gray Man, Margaret confiscates the book to prevent Ollie from having more hallucinations. Still impressed by the story from the quilters, Rose says that Ollie might have seen a burglar. Margaret calms them with their favorite story about the time when the wheat was so high that they could play hide and seek. The next morning, Rose comes rushing to wake her in a panic, saying that there is someone outside. The window is boarded up, and Margaret can barely peek, but a shadow does pass through the crack in a strange manner. Pushing aside the heaps of dust that had built up since yesterday, she opens the front door and steps out with a shotgun. The barn door is open and has very suspicious stains. There is no one inside, but through the gap between the boards, she sees a shadow moving slowly towards the entrance. Kicking the door open, she sees that it is Jacob's horse. The storm from the previous day had overturned the family's wagon, and the boy did not survive. Thomas was found beneath the wreckage in shock. The sheriff says that Esther is missing, but when Jacob is moved, he is holding hands with someone. On the brink of tension, Margaret removes the tarp and finds what seems to be her sister's body. But suddenly everyone gets startled when she abruptly rises and starts to cough. At Jacob's wake, the ladies comfort Esther, saying that we do not know God's plan. Margaret loses her patience and questions the general passivity of the neighborhood, but ends up being too harsh with Esther. During the burial, Rose's nose begins to bleed, and their mother decides to take her to Dr. Cox. The doctor blames the dry air but says it is nothing serious and recommends that Margaret continue with the sleeping pills. Back at home, she decides to sleep in the daughter's room, saving the fabric to seal the cracks. Rose reminds her that they should not sleep in the same room because of their mother's history of insomnia. The girl says that she wants to leave there, and Margaret promises that they can leave on the next train as soon as Henry sends more money. But when she tells this plan to the quilting ladies, they soon bring her bad news. Due to the sandstorms, train service has been interrupted indefinitely. Returning to the topic of the attacked family, they also mention that the father is the new suspect. There is no proof that the house was invaded, and he was the only survivor. Sometime later, Margaret gets angry to see the cow loose and blames Rose for risking the only livelihood of the family. She becomes even more furious when Ollie says it was the gray man. Shortly after that, she struggles to get some milk when she hears heavy footsteps upstairs. She climbs the stairs apologizing for the fight, but Rose is not there. Through the window, she sees that her daughters are far away. Very frightened, she starts to reconsider Ollie's accounts and grabs a shotgun to investigate if there is someone hiding in the barn attic. She gets startled to see the daughters inside, as she just left them in the living room, but Rose says they came after her because they are terrified. At this moment, the boards under Ollie's feet begin to push upwards. The girls run behind their mother and watch as the boards start to loosen, and a man emerges from the hole. His name is Wallace Grady, and he says he came at Henry's request, who even lent him a coat for the trip. He knows all their names and swears he only came to check on them. The storm left him in tatters, and he could not run because he has a problem with his leg, so he preferred to hide to avoid frightening them with his horrible appearance. Margaret does not believe any of it and demands that he leave. However, Rose's nose starts to bleed again right at that moment, and the man offers to help, claiming he has the power of healing in his hands. Without lowering her aim, Margaret allows him to try, but the procedure is not very smooth. He covers the girl's face with his filthy hand, and she seems to choke. But after Margaret pulls the two apart, the bleeding really does cease, and she decides to shelter the visitor for the time being. He shows his gratitude with tricks to keep the cow fed and healthy. The two agree that Wallace will hide in the barn so that the neighborhood doesn't start gossiping. That night, Margaret falls asleep holding her daughter and wakes up startled to find herself alone, but soon realizes that the girls are playing in the rain. The climate change is as unexpected as it is welcome, and one of the few explanations for this is Wallace's astonishing power. Days later, the ladies' meeting is abruptly interrupted when Rose comes to call her mother. Thomas came alone to the church to fetch water, and his appearance is alarming. The sheriff asks Margaret for help, and she finds her sister's house in a pitiful state. Esther says a man is taking care of Thomas, but then she seems to doubt whether that is reality or a dream. By the state of her back, Margaret concludes that she has not left the bed for a long time. With a broken heart, she tells the sheriff that Thomas needs to be taken away. As soon as the boy gets in the car, Esther runs to hug her sister and thank her for the visit, until she realizes what they are doing. She runs after the car in tears, shouting that Margaret will be like her soon and will regret acting this way. While talking about family troubles, Wallace tells about his sisters who died of scarlet fever. Ada and Ollie had the same illness, and the quarantine period was very difficult. She starts to cry when Wallace calls her a good mother. For the first time, she mentions her severe insomnia episodes, saying that the lack of sleep led her to do things she regrets. She quickly changes the subject when Rose arrives. The following week, a letter from Henry is finally delivered, and everyone gathers to hear the news. Ollie is in Wallace's lap, who seems to be weaving a straw bracelet for her. Rose reads to the point where Henry warns that the rest is just for their mother. Margaret begins to read, and her expression gradually changes, while Wallace keeps his eyes on her. Using sign language, she signals her daughter to bring the shotgun. Wallace hugs Ollie tightly, using the girl as a shield while Rose reads the rest of the letter aloud. Henry writes that all his money was in a letter addressed to them in the pocket of his coat, which was stolen by a false pastor. The impostor also attacked one of his co-workers and then inexplicably fled, as if he had turned to dust. Margaret demands that the impostor return their money and let go of her daughter, but Wallace wants the letter in exchange, fearing she might show it to the sheriff. Still using sign language, she warns Ollie when to duck and fires, missing anyone. The girl manages to break free, but Wallace takes the letter from Rose's hand. As he calmly burns the evidence, he says that the locks on the house aren't strong enough to protect them when the gray man decides to enter. After those terrible words, he bids them until next time and leaves. That night, Margaret decides not to take the sleeping pills and spends the whole night outside with the shotgun. Her mind soon begins to play tricks on her, and when Ollie appears in the barn, she cannot tell if it is real. Then Esther appears behind the girl, prophesying that Margaret too will breathe the gray man and become like her. The nightmare ends when Rose wakes her up, shocked to see her in a trance in the yard. Gradually, the myth of the gray man begins to completely dominate Margaret's thoughts, and she spends her nights investigating every grain of dust, afraid it might be a particle of the enemy. One night, the girls suddenly start screaming, and she tells them to open the door, even though it is locked from the outside. When she finally uses the key, the beds are inexplicably on fire. She douses the flames with a bucket of water, blaming herself for not sealing the door properly. Rose doesn't understand the reasoning, and Margaret explains that all the doors are locked, and Wallace could only have come through the cracks. The girl is surprised to hear her mother speaking this way and tries to remind her that the gray man doesn't exist. Wallace borrowed that book while living in the barn and only mentioned the character to scare her, as a sort of revenge for being expelled. But Margaret is already too obsessed to listen to these arguments. She says that Wallace proved his healing power, besides having set the beds on fire without forcing his way in. In the midst of this discussion, Esther knocks on the door, looking much better. She apologizes for her behavior that day and says she came to make amends. With some reluctance, Margaret lets her sister in. Esther tells her that she has improved a lot with the help of a pastor friend and has even been visiting her son regularly. Taking care not to sound too critical, she also says that everyone misses the girls. The truth is that Margaret hasn't left the house in a long time, nor does she let the girls go out. She doesn't get angry at her sister's advice because she isn't paying attention, still completely alert to any noise and always watching the dust. But when Esther mentions the rumors that she herself had to face when she didn't leave the house, she finally understands the warning and realizes the roles have reversed. To prove that the neighborhood is wrong about her, she decides to take the girls to the dance that very night. While getting ready for the party, Rose says that the sheriff will probably be there too, which could be a chance to get help and protection from Wallace. However, their mother says that the letter was burned and there is no proof. If the sheriff thinks the girls are in danger, he might take them away like he did with Thomas. Rose swears she won't say anything and soon forgets the subject, going to play with Ollie and the cat. Facing the mirror, Margaret rehearses her lines to attend the party looking like a normal person. Then she hears an alarming cough and Rose's voice calling for help, saying she can't breathe. She runs to help her daughter and, thinking the dress might be too tight, starts tearing it with her nails. Very frightened by this action, Rose denies that she screamed and says she was just laughing. The incident shakes the girl, and she says it might be better not to go to the dance, but their mother doesn't respond. To her horror, she uses a razor to make a small cut in her own leg. This is her way of coloring her face, determined to look healthy in public. Arriving at the party, her paranoia worsens, and she thinks all the whispers are about her. Seeing Rose talking to the sheriff, she fears that the girl is saying too much and decides to intervene. She ends up being pulled away to dance, and the sheriff wants to know how things are. His questions are harmless, typical of someone who hasn't seen the other person in a while, but Margaret reacts as if it were an interrogation, obviously getting defensive. Then her partner abruptly interrupts the dance and points down. Even the music stops, and everyone looks at the huge stain spreading on her dress because she miscalculated the depth of the cut. Mortified by the negative attention, which is precisely what she wanted to avoid, she can't hide the tears, and it only makes the situation worse. Trying to leave the hall, she faces Esther entering arm in arm with her worst enemy. No one understands her indignation until she herself realizes that the man is Reverend Shaw, whose face looks nothing like Wallace's. Concerned for her sister, Esther offers to visit her later and says she can bring a friend who helped her a lot during the hardest times. She shows the crucifix he gave her as a gift and says that things can change when we accept help. Rose is almost agreeing in place of their mother when Margaret starts shouting that this man can only be Wallace. Contrary to her own advice, she spills all the recent events to the sheriff, in front of everyone. Realizing that the risk of being taken for adoption is becoming increasingly real, Rose decides to defend her mother. She says the story is true. Her father was robbed by a wrongdoer who decided to take advantage of their hospitality and, when discovered, threatened to return. The sheriff and even the quilting ladies accept Rose's word, but Margaret ruins everything once again. She claims that Wallace can turn into dust and enter people's noses, taking over their bodies. If the sheriff was not worried before this party, now he is sure that she has gone mad. The three return home, and Margaret sews the dress while lamenting the huge fiasco. Rose is distressed to see that she is stitching her palm together with the fabric. She is also shocked when her daughter shows what she is doing and asks if Wallace has taken over her body. When someone knocks on the door, she stands up with the shotgun, and Rose asks her to calm down, as it could be a friend wanting to know if everything is alright. She tells the girl to lock herself in the room with her sister and put a rag under the door. There is no one outside when she goes to check. The fog obscures her vision, and she begins to hear voices, mixing Wallace's threats with Esther's prophecies. A shadow suddenly appears, and she pulls the trigger, but the figure seems to vanish into thin air. Rose comes to the door and asks what happened. She says that Wallace is in the air and could come in at any moment. Terrified, the girl obeys and locks herself in the room. Hours later, she sees that the rag has been dragged, as if someone had opened the door in the middle of the night. As she moves through the house with a lantern, we see someone running behind her. Even fearful, she continues investigating until she enters her mother's room and sees a horrific scene. Margaret is scratching the wall and speaking to Ada, begging her to let her in. When Rose surprises her, she sneaks out of the room. The girl hears keys turning in locks and finally understands that the haunting is her own mother. She is going through another episode of manic insomnia, and everything strange that has been happening is her own doing. Rose follows her mother to the yard and asks her to drop the shotgun, but when Margaret turns around, who she sees is Wallace. The words are those of Rose, imploring her not to shoot and swearing that she is her daughter, but the voice is Wallace's, and he says all this in a mocking tone. When the girl begins to sob, Margaret finally comes out of the trance. But she still doesn't accept her daughter's version about her insomnia and insists that she never mention any of this to anyone. Rose asks why they haven't left if the goal was to keep the family safe, and she replies that she needs to stay close to her three daughters, who are all part of herself. The girl starts to become frightened by the strange way her mother says all this and runs inside. Margaret follows her and starts looking for her in the house, but Rose has already left. She is trying to convince Ollie that this person is no longer their mother. To help the girl understand better, she says that Margaret breathed parts of the gray man and is acting like him. It is then that she trips over something and looks down, horrified to discover what is left of her aunt. To make matters worse for Rose, the storm is worse than ever, and Margaret says there is nowhere to go. As soon as the girl enters the house, someone arrives banging on the door, and she tries to scream for help. Ollie is startled to see the rough way her mother tries to control Rose, and the two begin to communicate through signs. Margaret is almost suffocating her daughter when Ollie opens the door and lets the sheriff in. As soon as he enters the room, Rose says that their mother isn't well. He asks them to wait in the living room while the adults talk. Margaret quickly contradicts her daughter and says she doesn't know what got into the girl. She also says that the shotgun is only because of the coyotes. The sheriff is not very convinced and asks if Esther came by earlier. Growing more wary, he says it's best to take the girls with him, at least until Henry returns in a few days. Margaret breaks down in tears, softening the sheriff's heart, but in reality, it is just a trick to get him closer to attack him with the razor. Seeing what their mother has just done, the girls panic, and the whirlwind outside is too strong to go out. Rose grabs the razor before going to talk to her mother, but she doesn't have the courage to use it. Margaret says she won't escape this and that there is only one way to keep the family together. She wants to divide the remaining pills with her two daughters so that they can all join Ada. Rose pretends to agree that there is no other option and just asks her mother to mix the medicine with fruits. Margaret starts to prepare the deadly snack when she hears the door banging. Rose comes running and says Ollie has run away. Tying a rope to the doorknob so she doesn't get lost, Margaret goes to look for the girl in the storm. Then Rose makes the hardest decision of her life and cuts the rope with the razor, leaving her mother lost in her own madness with nothing but dust around her. We see that Ollie was just hiding behind the door, safe. The next day, the two sisters are already on the train, heading for a new life.